It's late, the kind of late when the streets outside are empty, and the hum of life softens to a gentle murmur. You're listening to Bedtime Sleepy Historian, where the past drifts slowly through the quiet. So take a deep breath, and let your shoulders drop. You've found your place for the night. Maybe you're lying beneath a warm blanket, or maybe a candle flickers nearby. Tonight, we'll wander into the sooty, flower-dusted world of Victorian bakers, men and women who rose long before dawn, when the rest of London still slept. But beneath the soft smell of fresh bread, something darker hid. The life of a baker, during the 19th century, was among the most dangerous professions in Britain. Not because of knives or thieves, but because of flour dust, heat, and quiet poisonings. So let's step softly into the glow of a Victorian bakehouse, the air thick with heat and sweetness, and listen to the quiet labor of the people who fed an empire. The workday for a Victorian baker began when the world was still asleep. At midnight, sometimes earlier, the baker would rise from his narrow bed in a small flat behind the shop. The floorboards creaked, the lamp flickered to life, and he would pull on his flour-streaked apron, stiff from yesterday's labor. There was no morning in his life, not in the usual sense. The day began in darkness, and would end just as the sun began to climb. He worked while others dreamed. The bakehouse itself was a small, windowless room, usually built below the shop front to keep the ovens warm and out of sight. Down there, the air was heavy, warm even in winter. The smell of yeast hung thick as steam. A small coal furnace glowed in the corner, its iron door breathing orange light across the brick walls. Before he mixed a single batch, the baker swept away yesterday's crumbs, checked the coals, and stoked the fire higher. He measured flour by hand, in wooden bins, his arms dusted white from elbow to fingertip. The flour was fine, too fine. It filled the air like fog, and every breath carried the invisible grit deep into the lungs. There were no masks, no vents, no clean air. And as he began to knead the dough, the flour swirled and sparkled in the lamplight, beautiful, almost like snow caught in a candle beam. And in that quiet, timeless hour before dawn, the rhythm of kneading began. Press. Fold. Turn. Press. Fold. Turn. The sound of soft dough against the table, the creak of wood, the low crackle of coals in the oven. Flour, for all its innocence, was a silent killer in the Victorian bakehouse. Men who had worked the trade for decades developed what was known then as baker's lung, a slow, choking disease caused by the constant inhalation of flour dust and mold spores. They didn't know it then, of course. They only knew the coughing, the tightness in the chest, the way a strong young man could become weak and breathless before his 40th year. Medical journals of the 1800s began to take notice. Reports described bakers who could no longer climb stairs, who wheezed even while sitting, whose lungs, when examined, were pale and powdery inside. But flour was money. Bread was survival. And a baker who complained too much could easily be replaced. So they kept working, wiping the sweat from their brows, and telling themselves it was just a cold, or the dampness of the cellar. The fine dust clung to everything, clothes, hair, eyelids, nostrils. By morning, they all looked ghostly. Their eyelashes white, their skin dry and floured. And as the loaves rose, so too did the haze of air, each breath a mix of warmth, yeast, and invisible danger. And in the corner, beside the kneading table, a single oil lamp swayed gently with the draught from the oven door. The ovens of Victorian London were monstrous things, built of brick and iron, sometimes large enough for a man to crawl inside. They burned coal, sometimes coke, and their mouths glowed red. To keep them alive, bakers had to feed them constantly. A shovel of coal here, a stirring of embers there. The temperature was judged not by thermometer, but by feel, a hand held close, a quick instinct. Too hot, and the loaves would blister. Too cold, and the dough would collapse. The heat in those rooms was constant. It rolled and pulsed from the walls like waves. Even in winter, bakers often worked stripped to their undershirts, sweat running down their backs, evaporating before it could drip to the floor. There were burns, too, so many burns. A moment's distraction, and the peel, that long wooden paddle used to place bread in the oven, might slip. Arms and hands bore a permanent record, small round scars, shiny as glass. Yet they moved with grace, a kind of rhythm born from repetition. Each loaf turned, each crust tested by touch. They worked in silence, the only sounds the hiss of steam and the quiet roar of the oven's breath. And in the early hours the whole room glowed like the inside of a lantern. Victorian bakers faced not only heat and dust, but a peculiar problem of trust. Bread was the staple food of the poor, and competition among bakers was fierce. Some, desperate to stretch their profits, began to adulterate their flour. They mixed in chalk to whiten it, alum to stiffen it, plaster of Paris to add weight, and even ground bones to mimic the texture of fine wheat. Customers rarely knew. Bread was bread, and cheap bread was often the only kind they could afford. But these adulterants were poisonous. Alum in particular caused stomach pain, anemia, and a slow wasting that doctors struggled to explain. There were reformers who tried to expose the practice, chemists who analyzed loaves, journalists who wrote about the White Death of the bread trade. But regulations came slowly. And for honest bakers, it was agony to see their trade corrupted. They were trapped between conscience and survival. Still, every night they returned to their ovens, knowing that one bag of bad flour, one mistake in purity, could mean illness for those who depended on them. And the firelight flickered softly across the flour bins. There is something tender and almost tragic about the sight of a boy standing beside a roaring oven at 2 a.m. His eyes half closed, his body swaying slightly with exhaustion, his small hands pale beneath a thin coating of flour dust. This was the world of the apprentice baker, the quiet backbone of every Victorian bakehouse. Most of these boys came from poor families. Their parents, unable to afford schooling beyond the basics, sent them into trades as soon as they were old enough to hold a broom or lift a bucket. The baker's trade, though hard, was considered respectable. It promised discipline, food, and a roof, things not always guaranteed elsewhere. The apprenticeship would last years. During that time, the boy belonged to the bakehouse more than to himself. He lived above it or behind it, in a cramped little room with a narrow bed and a single window blackened with soot. His alarm clock was not a bell, but the muffled rumble of the ovens being stoked downstairs. When the master called, there was no hesitation. The boy slipped from bed, pulled on a shirt that never quite came clean, and padded barefoot down the stairs. The air grew warmer with each step until it wrapped around him like a thick blanket. The glow from the fire made the flour particles in the air glisten, turning the cellar into a kind of golden fog. There was no gentle start to his shift. The work began immediately, fetching water, measuring flour, cleaning trays, checking the leavening buckets that sat near the fire to stay warm. Each movement had to be careful and quiet. The master did not tolerate clumsiness, especially not when a single overturned bowl could waste half a night's profit. The apprentice learned by watching. Words were scarce in the bakehouse, because breath was precious and mistakes costly. Instead, instruction came in gestures, a nod, a frown, a flick of the wrist showing how to fold dough, how to test its readiness by pressing a thumb into it, and watching how it rose back. He learned the language of silence, the communication of those who work too long and too hard to speak aloud. By the time most of London was turning in its sleep, the boy's arms already ached from kneading. The rhythm was endless: press, fold, turn. The table beneath his hands was warm and slightly sticky, though wood polished smooth by years of the same motion. The dough was alive, soft, elastic, breathing faintly with the gas of fermentation. Sometimes, when exhaustion blurred his mind, he thought he could feel its heartbeat. Meals were simple, often eaten standing up. A crust of yesterday's bread dipped into weak tea, maybe a piece of cheese if the master was generous. They said bakers never went hungry, but it was not entirely true. The scent of bread could torture the stomach, an aroma so constant that hunger became confused with habit. And then there was the heat. The ovens radiated it like suns, and the cellar trapped it. Sweat rolled down the boy's back, soaking his collar. His hair clung to his forehead. When he wiped his face, he left streaks of flour that made him look ghostly, older than he was. His hands were rough, his nails permanently white, his lungs filled with dust he could never quite cough out. Sometimes, when the master was in a softer mood, he'd tell a story. Not about glory or romance, but about bread. He'd talk of how it had fed armies and kings alike, how it had been called the staff of life. The apprentice would listen, not because he cared for the history, but because the sound of the voice broke the monotony. In rare moments of calm, the boy might rest for a few minutes, leaning against the wall and staring at the flickering orange light reflected on the ceiling. The air shimmered there, alive with heat. He could hear the faint breathing of the fire, the soft creak of wood, and the bubbling whisper of fermenting dough. But rest never lasted long. There were trays to prepare, loaves to shape, flour to sift. His body moved automatically, guided by the repetition of countless nights. And though he longed for sleep, there was something hypnotic in that rhythm. The hands learned what the mind no longer had strength to think about. The master would sometimes look at him, not unkindly, but with a weary understanding. He had once been an apprentice himself. He knew the burn of sleepless eyes, the ache in the shoulders that never quite went away. But tradition held that hardship made a good baker. "You have to earn the bread before you make it," he'd mutter, handing the boy another sack to lift. If the apprentice managed to endure his years of training, he would become a journeyman baker, free to find work in other shops or, if luck smiled, to open one of his own. But few reached that far. Many left the trade before their lungs gave out or their backs curved with the strain. Those who stayed found a strange kind of peace in the suffering. The bakehouse became their world, the oven their sun, the bread their purpose. For them, there was no night or day, only the cycle of dough rising and falling, of fire warming and cooling. And yet, despite all the hardship, there was something almost sacred in their labor. To make bread was to transform simple things, flour, water, salt, into life itself. And perhaps that knowledge, however dimly felt, kept them going. When the master finally gave the order to rest, the boy sank down onto the cool stone floor, his back against a barrel of flour. His eyelids fluttered, his breath slowed. The world around him blurred into a soft haze of gold and gray. The last thing he saw before sleep took him was the shimmer of the firelight across the ceiling beams, like the reflection of sunlight through shallow water. When people picture the baker of the Victorian age, they often imagine a man, strong-armed, sleeves rolled, tending the oven's fire. But behind almost every good baker stood a woman. Not in the background, as the polite phrase goes, but in the small, vital space between the oven and the world, the front of the shop. The baker's wife was the face that customers saw. While her husband and his apprentices labored in the heat below, she lived in the rhythm of the dawn above. Her day began a little later, though still before most of the city stirred. She rose quietly, tying her hair in a knot, and descended to the shop while the morning was still blue. The smell met her first, warm yeast, soft crusts, and coal smoke. It was an aroma that clung to her clothes so completely that she carried it wherever she went, like a perfume of labor and love. She lit a small oil lamp, its flame trembling as she trimmed the wick, and set about arranging the counter. The front room of a Victorian bakery was not grand. It was narrow, with a wooden counter worn smooth by coins and elbows, a little display window fogged by heat, and rows of shelves lined with cooling loaves. In the soft half-light, the bread gleamed faintly golden, still whispering as the crusts cooled, that quiet crackling sound that only fresh bread makes. The baker's wife wiped down the counter with a damp cloth, then lifted each loaf, turning it slightly so its best side faced forward. She took pride in the display. To her, each round loaf was not only food but proof that the night's labor had gone well, that nothing had burned, that the yeast had done its silent work. By 5 o'clock, the first customers began to appear. Women mostly, maids sent from nearby houses, shawls drawn over their hair, baskets hanging from their arms. They greeted her with bleary politeness, sometimes with gossip whispered behind gloved hands. "How's the price of flour this week?" one would ask. "Up again," the baker's wife might reply, smoothing her apron. "They say it's the harvest in France. Always the harvest somewhere." Their exchanges were gentle and slow, punctuated by the hollow thump of bread being placed on the counter. Sometimes she added a few currant buns for the children, or a roll still warm enough to fog the paper she wrapped it in. Money was tight for everyone. Many customers kept accounts, small ledgers marked in pencil. The baker's wife handled these with care, making tidy notes in the books she kept beneath the counter. It was she, not her husband, who knew which families could pay promptly and which might need another week. In that quiet accounting lay both mercy and risk. And then there were the children. They came with coins clasped tightly in red hands, often sent by mothers too busy to come themselves. Some peered up shyly over the counter, others spoke with a practiced air of importance. She treated them all with the same gentle formality. A coin was a coin, whether given by a lady or a barefoot boy. When trade slowed, she tidied again. She brushed crumbs into a tin, folded paper bags, and sometimes stepped outside to wipe the condensation from the window. Through the misted glass she could see the street waking, lamplighters extinguishing their flames, milkmen calling, a constable strolling past. If she looked up the lane, she could sometimes glimpse her husband for a moment through the bakehouse window below street level. He moved slowly now, the rush of the night behind him, his face glistening with sweat. She might catch his eye, just briefly, and raise a hand in quiet greeting. He would nod, too tired to smile, but grateful for the sight of her in the morning light. There were other women too, though their names rarely appeared in records. In the countryside, a baker's daughters might help twist dough into rolls or dust loaves with flour before baking. In the cities, young women worked as shop assistants, spending long hours on their feet in the warm air of the shop, wearing dark dresses that soon turned pale with flour at the cuffs. For them, the bakery was both work and community. They heard every story that passed through the neighborhood: who was ill, who had quarreled, who had married, who had gone to war. The baker's shop was a confessional of sorts, a place where people spoke softly while coins changed hands. And sometimes, between customers, the women would talk among themselves. They shared small dreams, of better dresses, of holidays that never came, of sons who might find work outside the city. The conversation was hushed, shaped by the rhythm of the doorbell that rang each time someone entered. The baker's wife had her own worries. She kept an ear out for the sound of coughing from below, for her husband's heavy steps, for the occasional crash of a dropped tray. She knew too well the toll the tray took on his body, the burns that never healed properly, the breath that came shorter with each passing year. She kept ointments on the shelf, small cloths for bandages, and a kettle always hot for tea. Yet she did not complain. Complaining did no good in the Victorian world. Instead, she found her solace in small rituals, the wiping of counters, the folding of paper, the counting of change. These were her prayers, her way of keeping the world in order. When the rush ended around mid-morning, she would lock the till, draw the curtains halfway, and sit for a moment on the stool behind the counter. The shop would fall quiet except for the ticking of a small clock and the faint breathing of the oven below. She might take a piece of bread, an imperfect one, too dark or misshapen for sale, and spread a bit of jam across it. She ate slowly, savoring the taste. Bread made by her husband always seemed different to her, richer somehow. Perhaps it was simply because she knew the cost of it, not the price in pennies, but the hours, the sweat, the weary silence behind every loaf. Sometimes a neighbor would stop by then, bringing a cup of coffee or a few words of conversation. They would talk softly about the weather, about their children, about the never-ending rise of prices. They spoke the language of survival, shared between women who knew the weight of work that went unseen. By noon, the light through the front window turned harsh and white. The smell of bread lingered, fading slowly as the hours passed. The baker's wife would stand again, stretch her stiff back, and sweep the floor one last time. Soon she would go upstairs to tend to the rooms above, to mend clothes, cook a meal, or rest a little before the next night's cycle began. When evening came, she might sit by the small window, watching the lamps being lit in the street. Below, she could already hear her husband stirring, preparing once more for the long hours ahead. The sound of metal tools, the scrape of coal, the muffled cough. She looked at the clock, sighed, and folded her hands in her lap. The world of the bakery turned endlessly, and she was part of its turning, the steady heart that kept it beating. As she blew out the lamp on the counter, the smell of bread still hung in the air, sweet and heavy. The glass of the window reflected her face for a moment, pale, calm, eyes thoughtful. And from below came the familiar, comforting sound. The soft roar of the oven, the faint hiss of steam. Dawn, for the Victorian baker, was not the beginning of the day. It was the middle of his night. By the time the first light crept across the rooftops, he had already been awake for hours. The town above him was only beginning to stir, carriages rattling on cobblestones, roosters crowing behind fences, the occasional milkman's call. But below the street, in the warm half-dark of the bakehouse, the world was already alive with the slow, patient labor of bread. The baker moved quietly, methodically. His every gesture had been shaped by repetition, the turn of the wrist, the fold of the dough, the way he leaned just slightly as he placed the peel deep into the oven's mouth. To him, movement was memory. He did not think much as he worked, thought was for later, when the fires had cooled. The air down here was always thick. Not unpleasant, just dense with heat, the smell of yeast, and a faint edge of smoke. His shirt clung to his skin, damp from both steam and sweat. Around him, the bakehouse seemed to breathe. The coals glowed, the dough rose, the wooden rafters creaked softly as the temperature shifted. This hour, between night and morning, was the quietest. Apprentices still half asleep, their faces pale in the glow of the oven. The baker's wife above, arranging the shop. Outside, a world unaware of the heat and labor below its streets. He looked toward the door sometimes, where a thin line of cooler air slipped through the cracks. He could smell the faintest trace of rain or chimney smoke from the world outside. It reminded him that morning was coming, a kind of promise. He reached for the dough that had been resting under cloth for hours. The linen felt cool in his hands, the dough beneath slightly warm, alive. He pressed it gently, testing its spring, then began to shape it. Each loaf received the same careful attention, pressed, folded, turned, and tucked. He worked without hurry. Speed came later, when the ovens demanded it. For now, there was a meditative rhythm to the kneading, a push and pull that echoed faintly against the stone walls. His hands, wide and scarred, moved as if remembering something older than speech. Every baker had his preferred rhythm. Some hummed softly under their breath, old folk tunes from their youth. Others worked in silence, listening to the sound of dough against the board. For this baker, silence suited him. He liked the hum of the oven, the whisper of his own breath, the way the world above still slept. He knew dawn was close when the light began to change. Even down here, beneath street level, a faint grayness crept through the small window near the ceiling. It was a tired kind of light, filtering through soot and grime, turning the air a dull silver. He wiped his forehead on his sleeve, then reached for the next batch. Around him, the apprentices stirred into fuller wakefulness. One fetched more flour from the sack, another brushed ashes from the oven door. Their movements were slow, uncertain, but steady. There was an unspoken understanding in the bakehouse, no unnecessary noise. Words came only when needed. A quiet, "Hand me that," or "Watch the time." The rest was soundless cooperation, shaped by exhaustion and routine. When the first batch came out, the air shifted. The heat became richer, the smell more intense, that moment when flour, yeast, and fire combine into something alive. The baker leaned close to inspect the crusts, tapping them gently with a knuckle. He could tell by sound whether they were done. A hollow note meant perfection. He arranged them on wooden trays, their surfaces glistening faintly with moisture. Steam curled upward, catching in the slanted morning light. For a brief moment, the bakehouse looked almost holy, a chapel of labor, where bread was both sustenance and symbol. Outside, he could hear the first footsteps on the street above. Someone sweeping, a cart rolling, the muffled bark of a dog. The world was waking. He felt that small, familiar ache in his back. It came every morning now, a dull throb that reminded him how long he had done this work. When he was younger, he barely noticed the hours. Now, each dawn felt heavier. Yet there was comfort in the wait. To bake was to serve, and to serve was to belong. He took a sip of water from a tin cup, the metal cool against his lips. It tasted faintly of flour dust and smoke. Then he turned to the next task, the pastries. Victorian bakeries often made simple sweets alongside bread, currant buns, Chelsea rolls, little tarts filled with jam or custard. They were luxuries, meant for those who could afford a bit of pleasure with their morning tea. He handled them with the same care as bread, though he allowed himself a trace of quiet pride. Pastries, after all, showed skill. By 6 o'clock, the bakehouse was a world of motion. The oven glowed, apprentices shouted softly over one another, trays clattered. The baker's mind moved through the tasks ahead like a clock, this batch in, that one out, new dough to mix, old ashes to clear. And then came the moment he loved best, when he opened the bakehouse door and carried the first trays up into the shop. The morning light hit him full in the face, cool, clean, almost startling after the red glow below. He blinked, adjusting. The air smelled different here, not of yeast, but of wet cobblestones and fresh air. His wife turned at the sound of the door. She smiled faintly, her face pale but warm in the lamplight. Without words, they shared a small glance, one of understanding, of endurance. She wiped her hands and helped him arrange the loaves behind the counter. The bell over the door jingled, and the first customers entered. The baker stepped back into the shadows of the shop while his wife greeted them. He preferred not to speak much at this hour. His work, he felt, spoke for him. Through the open door, he could see the street now alive with motion, chimney smoke rising, horses clopping by, a child skipping ahead of her mother. The world seemed unaware of the sweat and fire that had birthed its morning bread. But he did not mind. This was his rhythm, his peace. When the rush ended and the shop quieted again, he went to the doorway and leaned against the frame. The warmth of the bakehouse clung to him, though the cool breeze felt good on his skin. He took a slow breath, letting the air fill his lungs. The city smelled of everything: bread, smoke, coal, rain, people. But beneath it all was the steady pulse of life, the same one that kept his ovens burning. He looked down at his hands, flour-streaked and calloused. Hands that had fed hundreds, perhaps thousands of people. Hands that had known both burns and blessings. He flexed them slowly, then rubbed them on his apron. Another night was done. Another dawn had arrived. He would sleep soon, when the world was fully awake. But for now, he stood in the threshold, between the heat of the oven and the cool breath of morning, between the invisible labor of night and the visible calm of day. He closed his eyes for a moment. The sounds of the street softened, faded, until all that remained was the quiet hum of the oven below, steady as a heartbeat. And somewhere deep in the bakehouse, a loaf cracked softly as it cooled. The baker's greatest worry was not the oven, nor the burns, nor even the long nights. It was the price of flour. Flour was his lifeblood, white, fine, endlessly consumed. Yet, in the Victorian age, it was also a thing of uncertainty, rising and falling with the invisible tides of trade and harvest. A dry summer in Russia, a poor crop in France, a ship delayed by weather, all these could ripple through the markets and arrive, quietly and cruelly, in the baker's ledger. He could feel it before he saw it. Whispers among suppliers. A slower nod from the miller. The way the flour sack arrived a little lighter, though the price tag grew heavier. It was a kind of dread that settled slowly, like dust. Each morning, as he worked the dough, he thought in numbers as well as in touch. How many loaves could he make from one sack? How thin could he stretch the margin before the bread grew too light, too poor, too strange-tasting to sell? Some bakers gave in to temptation. They added chalk, alum, or even ground bones to their flour to whiten it or make it go further. These tricks were whispered about, half condemned, half envied. The laws against adulteration existed, but enforcement was weak. Inspectors came rarely, and fines were smaller than ruin. He never liked the thought of it. Bread to him was sacred, the daily communion of ordinary people. To spoil it for profit felt like a kind of sin. Yet there were nights when he looked at his accounts and wondered how long he could keep his conscience clean. He remembered once, years ago, when flour prices had doubled after a poor harvest. Customers grumbled at the raised cost of bread, but few understood the math behind it. He had gone to the miller himself, walking through fields that lay silent after reaping, the stalks dry and sharp beneath his boots. The miller, a gray-faced man, had simply shrugged. "Bad grain," he'd said. "All over the country. Nothing to be done." So the baker had returned home, his heart heavy, calculating quietly how much smaller each loaf must be. In those days, people noticed their bread. Bread was not background, it was the center of the meal, the thing that held families together. To reduce a loaf was to invite complaint, even anger. He remembered the first morning when a customer looked at him sharply and said, "Smaller today, aren't they?" He had nodded gently. "The wheat's dear this year," he'd murmured. And she had pursed her lips, counting her coins again before leaving. The weight of flour was a weight on his soul. It governed everything: the hours of work, the heat of the oven, the strain of his body. And yet it was so fragile, so dependent on forces beyond his control. Some nights, when the bakehouse grew quiet, he would sit by the cooling oven and run a handful of flour between his fingers. It was soft as snow, lighter than ash, and for all its gentleness, it held power enough to make or unmake a man. He thought of the farmers who grew it, men he would never meet, bent over the soil miles away. He thought of the millers who ground it, the merchants who shipped it, the accountants who set its price. He, the baker, stood at the end of this long, invisible chain. And when it broke on him. There was a kind of poetry in it, he sometimes thought, a cruel one, but poetry all the same. Bread was born of patience, rain, harvest, grind, mix, rise, bake. Every step demanded faith that the next would follow. When prices rose too high, he found small ways to cope. He mixed flours, barley, rye, even a little potato, to stretch the wheat. He worked longer hours, baking smaller, cheaper rolls for poorer families. He let the apprentices go one by one, then took on their work himself. His wife helped quietly, keeping the accounts with sharper care, trimming costs where she could. Together they made do, the way so many Victorians did, not by triumph, but by endurance. Sometimes they heard of riots in other towns. Bread riots, they called them. Crowds of hungry people breaking bakery windows, seizing loaves, shouting in the streets. It was always blamed on someone else, the millers, the merchants, the government, but in the end, it was the bakers who stood at the front, between hunger and authority. He understood the anger, though he feared it. He knew what it was to look at an empty shelf, to feel the weight of others' expectations pressing against your own survival. He knew, too, that a single bad month could undo years of work. There were weeks when he barely earned enough to buy the next sack of flour. The coins clinked thinly in the till, and the cupboard upstairs grew emptier. Still, he baked. There was no other way to live. Sometimes he dreamed of leaving the trade altogether. He imagined a small farm, perhaps, a quieter life, where the earth itself answered to his touch. But he would wake before dawn to the smell of yeast, to the warmth of the oven, and know that this was where he belonged. The flour itself seemed to call him. When he opened a new sack, the sound was like a sigh. The air filled with a pale mist, fine enough to make him blink. He could see it drifting in the slanting lamplight, a soft white snowfall that settled on everything, on the wooden table, on his hair, on the floorboards beneath his boots. It was beautiful in its way, though he knew how treacherous it was. Too much dust, too long inhaled, and the lungs grew stiff. He had heard of bakers' asthma, men coughing flour until they could no longer work. But that was a worry for another time. For now, the flour was light, and his hands were steady. He poured it through his fingers like sand, feeling its softness one last time before mixing it with water. Once it touched water, it was no longer his, it began its slow transformation, alive and demanding. The dough took shape beneath his palms, heavy and warm. He thought, not for the first time, that it was a small miracle, how this simple mixture could feed so many. He pressed, folded, and turned it until it became smooth, pliant, obedient. When the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window, he paused. The flour in the air caught the light, glowing faintly like dust in a dream. For a moment, the bakehouse looked almost weightless, as if time itself had stopped to watch. He wiped his hands on his apron, exhaled slowly, and looked toward the oven. The fire was steady, glowing deep red. The world outside might rise and fall with markets and harvests, but here, in this small space of heat and labor, something eternal endured. He reached for the first tray, his movements slow and deliberate. The dough, the flour, the fire, all of it bound together in an old, unspoken faith. And as he set the loaves to bake, the quiet hiss of steam filled the air. The baker understood poverty not as a stranger, but as a neighbor. It lived around the corner, behind narrow doors and soot-darkened windows, in streets where the smell of bread carried farther than the coin to buy it. In every city and town, there were families who could not afford even the smallest loaf. They watched, instead, as others left the baker's shop with warm paper-wrapped bundles in their arms. Children trailed behind, breathing deeply as though the scent itself might fill them. Bread was more than food in the Victorian age. It was the measure of survival. To eat bread was to belong to the living. To go without it was to slip quietly toward despair. The baker knew this, and though he lived by selling, he could never forget the ache in those eyes that lingered by his window. He had grown up poor himself, once the son of a man who delivered flour by handcart, scraping enough to feed a family of 7. He remembered hunger not as pain but as a slow, hollow patience, a waiting that felt endless. Now, as a baker, he met that same hunger every day. It wore many faces. The widowed mother clutching a coin and asking softly if half a loaf might do. The chimney-sweep boy with soot on his cheeks and a penny clenched so tightly it left an imprint in his skin. The old laborer who stood outside pretending to read the notices, though he was only watching the bread being moved behind the glass. The baker had a system. Not official, not written, just a quiet habit of mercy. At the end of each day, he set aside what he could, a few unsold loaves, a handful of rolls gone slightly stale, the crusts trimmed from the edges of pies. His wife would wrap them in paper, tie them with string, and leave them near the door at dusk. Sometimes she wrote small notes. "Take what you need." Sometimes she left no note at all. They never watched to see who came. They knew better. Dignity was fragile, and hunger already stole enough of it. By morning, the bundle was always gone. There were nights when the baker worked late, and through the half-open door he could see the shape of someone passing quietly, a hand reaching, a shadow bending. He said nothing, only listened to the faint sound of footsteps fading down the lane. In the poorer districts, bread was often shared among many. A single loaf might feed a whole family for a day, sliced thinly, soaked in broth, or spread with drippings saved from a joint of meat. Sometimes it was toasted on the fire's edge, sometimes eaten plain. Always it was treated with respect, not waste, not indulgence, but gratitude. In workhouses, bread was different. It was coarser, harder, baked in vast slabs and cut into rigid portions. The bakers supplied some of these institutions, though the contracts paid poorly. He did it more from duty than profit. He knew what kind of bread it was, heavy, gray, dense with inferior flour. Bread for bodies, not for joy. Yet even there, among the long benches and metal cups, bread had its small grace. The warmth of it, the smell when it first arrived, the steam rising faintly in the air. For many inmates, that scent was the only comfort of the day. The baker once visited a poorhouse to inspect an oven. It was an old brick one, poorly kept, the floor cracked and the draught uneven. The man in charge showed him the dough, pale, lifeless, mixed in wooden tubs that had long since absorbed the sour smell of years. When the loaves were baked, he took one in his hands and broke it open. It was heavy as stone. The crust crumbled like dust. He tasted a piece out of curiosity, then set it down quietly. Later that night, back in his own bakehouse, he stared at his own loaves cooling on the rack. The difference struck him deeply, not only in taste but in care. Bread, he thought, reflected the heart of the one who made it. He began then to do something small but stubborn. When he baked for the poorhouse, he used his best flour, even though it cost him. No one noticed, perhaps. No one thanked him. But he did it anyway, because he could not bear the thought of hunger meeting cruelty. On Sundays, when the ovens were quiet, he sometimes walked through the poorer lanes of the town. Children played barefoot among the gutters, women stood in doorways gossiping softly, men smoked pipes on the steps. And always, in the air, was the faint smell of baking, from homes, from corner shops, from his own bakehouse farther off. He watched the faces of people passing by. When they smelled bread, their eyes softened. Even the tired ones. It was as if the scent alone promised safety, even if only for a moment. He knew some blamed bakers for the cost of living. Newspapers printed angry letters when bread prices rose. Crowds sometimes muttered outside the shops. But he also knew that, in quiet hours, those same people came to him, hat in hand, asking for credit or a crust for their child. And he gave what he could, though each gift was a weight on his own survival. There was one woman he remembered especially. She came every Thursday, always with the same shy smile, always asking for half a loaf. She paid exactly the same few coins, no matter the price that week. He never mentioned it, never corrected her. When flour prices soared, he simply made her portion smaller, then larger again when they fell. It was their unspoken agreement, an exchange of kindness wrapped in silence. One evening she brought him a small gift, a cloth embroidered with a simple pattern of wheat stalks. "For your counter," she said softly, setting it down. "You keep us fed." He looked at her, unable to speak for a moment. He nodded once, and she left. For months after, the cloth lay beneath the till, faded now, but still there. A reminder that his work, humble as it was, carried weight beyond measure. The baker often thought that poverty had a smell, not foul, but faint and lingering, like damp wool and cold dust. Yet when those same people held a warm loaf in their hands, something changed in the air. The scent of bread overpowered everything else. For a moment it felt like grace. As he grew older, he came to understand that his trade was not simply about food. It was about dignity. Bread was the one thing the poor could still buy fresh, still break with their hands, still share with family or neighbor. It was the last luxury left when all others were gone. On nights when he sat beside the cooling oven, too tired to climb the stairs, he thought of the loaves he had given away, the mouths they had filled, the small hunger he had eased. It was not charity, not pride, just the quiet duty of a man who understood what it meant to be hungry. Outside, the city slept under a blanket of coal smoke. Somewhere, a cart rumbled past. Somewhere, a child turned in its sleep, dreaming of warm bread. The baker leaned back against the wall, his hands folded on his apron, his eyes half closed. The oven beside him pulsed faintly with heat, a soft orange glow breathing against the bricks. He let the warmth touch his skin, and in that gentle hum of fire and flour, he found peace, the peace of knowing that, for one more night, no one in his street would go entirely hungry. And from the heart of the bakehouse came that same eternal sound. The faint pop of cooling crusts, the whisper of settling ash. It happened on a winter's night, one of those nights when the wind seemed to walk the streets like a restless spirit, rattling shutters, lifting snow into the air, and whispering under every door. The baker had risen as usual, sometime after midnight, his breath visible in the cold of the bakehouse. But this time, the fire refused to wake. The oven, ancient and loyal for decades, had gone silent. He knelt before it, coaxing the coals, adding kindling, breathing carefully into the dark mouth. Sparks flared briefly, then died. The chimney gave a low sigh, as if weary of years of work. He tried again. Wood, paper, a twist of straw, all caught and flickered out. The stone inside had cooled, and with it, the heart of his trade. For a moment, he simply sat on his heels, listening. The bakehouse, usually alive with small sounds, the crackle of flame, the sigh of rising dough, the tick of the iron peel against the wall, was utterly still. Above, the faint creak of the floor told him his wife was awake, waiting. She would be lighting the shop lamps soon, arranging the counter, expecting to hear the familiar hum of fire below. But tonight, there was only silence. He rubbed his hands together, breath clouding in the air, and stood. The dough waited on the table, pale, round, living things, swelling gently beneath linen cloths. Without heat, they would overproof and collapse, wasted. He felt a slow ache in his chest. The oven was more than a tool. It was a companion, a creature of brick and flame that had shared every dawn of his working life. Its breath was his breath. Its silence felt like death. He fetched his tools, a poker, a shovel, a broom. Methodically, he scraped out the old ashes, gray and soft as snow. They hissed faintly, whispering secrets of 1,000 mornings gone. Beneath them, he found the bricks blackened and cracked. A seam had opened near the flue, a wound in the stone. The heat had been escaping slowly for months, perhaps years, until finally it had given out. Repair would take days. Perhaps more. He could not afford to stop, but neither could he bake without flame. He sat at the worktable, staring at the dough. The lamplight flickered against the flour-dusted walls. For a long time, he did not move. When dawn came, he went upstairs. His wife looked up from the counter, reading the truth in his face before he spoke. "The oven's gone cold," he said simply. She nodded once, her eyes soft with worry. "How long?" He shook his head. "Too long." The words hung between them like frost. By mid-morning, he had gone to the blacksmith, then the mason, then the miller, anyone who might know how to fix a cracked flue, anyone who could spare a few pounds of good coal. Each offered sympathy, a promise, but little else. Everyone was struggling. Everyone's hands were already full. He returned home by noon, his breath turning to mist as he pushed open the bakehouse door. The air inside felt hollow without its usual warmth. The dough had collapsed into itself, a ruin of bubbles and sagging edges. He swept it up silently and carried it to the bin. His wife brought him tea, setting the cup beside him without a word. The steam curled upward, fragile and ghostly. For the first time in years he sat idle. The stillness pressed against him, heavy and unfamiliar. He could hear everything now, the faint drip of melting frost, the tick of the clock, the distant clatter of carts outside. Without the oven's heartbeat, the world seemed colder. The apprentices did not come that night. There was no work to be done. He sat alone by the hearth, staring into the dark mouth of the oven as if waiting for it to breathe again. And as he sat, memories came, unbidden but soft. The first day he built the fire there, when he was barely 20 and full of pride. The laughter of his wife as she brought him bread still steaming, saying it was almost too good to sell. The nights of exhaustion when he leaned against the warm brick, half asleep. The long mornings when the smell of baking had risen through the floorboards, calling the town awake. He realized then that the oven was not only his livelihood. It was his life's witness. It had seen every joy and sorrow, every hunger and offering. It had heard every whispered prayer for warmth, every sigh of relief when the loaves came out whole. He reached out and placed his hand on the cold stone. It felt strange, rougher than he remembered, lifeless. For a moment he thought of giving up. There were newer bakeries now, with iron stoves and steam systems, faster and cleaner. Men half his age, full of energy and ambition. He could sell the shop, perhaps move to the country. Live quietly. But then he thought of the people. The woman who came every Thursday for half a loaf. The children who pressed their noses to his window. The poor who found a bundle at his door. What would they eat if his oven went cold forever? He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and made his choice. For 3 days he worked to mend the oven himself. He patched the cracks with mortar, sealed the flue, rebuilt the bricks one by one. His hands bled from the rough edges. His back ached from bending. But slowly, the shape returned. On the 4th night, he built a small fire. The kindling caught reluctantly, then flared. The flames danced low, cautious, testing their old home. He fed them gently, watching as the orange glow began to spread across the stone. When the first real heat returned, he smiled for the first time in days. It was not a large smile, just the faint upward curve of a man who has survived. He baked again that night. Only a few loaves, to test the oven. They came out uneven, one side pale, one side dark. But when he broke one open, the scent filled the bakehouse, that deep, sweet warmth of life renewed. His wife came down, drawn by the smell. She stood beside him, quiet. He handed her a piece, still steaming. She took a bite, and her eyes glistened. "It's good," she said softly. He nodded. "It's ours again." Later, when the loaves cooled on the rack, he sat back on his stool and listened. The sound returned, the faint cracking of crust, the soft hiss of steam, the whisper of bread settling into stillness. It was like hearing an old friend breathe after a long silence. Outside, snow fell gently on the rooftops. The city was asleep, wrapped in quiet. He looked around the bakehouse, the tools, the sacks of flour, the faint dust in the air catching lamplight. All ordinary things, yet sacred in their endurance. He thought then that perhaps the oven's silence had been a kind of lesson, a reminder that even fire must rest, that even labor must pause before it can begin again. He rose, banked the fire, and turned down the lamp. The last glow of the coals shimmered faintly in the dark. He stood for a moment longer, breathing in the smell of bread, of warmth, of time itself. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "That'll do." And from the heart of the bakehouse came one last gentle crackle. A soft, contented sigh of cooling stone. And so the night winds down, and the bakery sleeps, quiet at last. The ovens are warm but no longer roaring. The flour dust settles like soft snow across the wooden tables. The loaves rest on their racks, golden and fragrant, as if sighing in relief after their long journey from dough to bread. The baker leans back on his stool, feeling the gentle ache of a day, a night, a lifetime of labor. His wife has climbed the stairs, her own chores completed, her eyes soft with quiet satisfaction. Outside, the streets of Victorian London are hushed under the mist and frost. The lamps glow faintly in the fog, distant bells ring slowly, and the wind whispers through narrow lanes. You, listening, can breathe slowly now, letting the rhythm of the bakehouse settle within you. Feel the warmth of the oven, the scent of bread rising softly, the slow pulse of life that comes from patience, care, and quiet endurance. Allow your thoughts to drift like steam curling above a hot loaf. There is nothing urgent here, nothing demanding. Just the gentle world of flour, yeast, and fire. Rest now, as the baker rests. Let the steady crackle of the hearth and your imagination lull your mind into calm. Let your eyelids grow heavy with the same slow ease that settles over the bakehouse. You have witnessed the labor, the love, the care of a world long past, and in its quiet persistence there is peace. Sleep, then, wrapped in the soft aroma of warm bread, in the quiet hum of ovens, in the timeless rhythm of work and rest. And as you drift, know that somewhere in the flickering shadows of history, the hearth keeps crackling. Good night.